to my computer. There we go. Thank you. Okay. Oh my gosh. Here we go. Thank you all for being here. Post your social media, please, in the chat so we can follow any new folks that we don't already follow. Little plug for our July happy hour is going to be a little different. I figured maybe some people were sick of my face and my voice, and maybe we just want to do a little like more casual thing where we have beers and we like workshop things we're working on, but extremely casual, low pressure, people talking to each other, getting ideas, workshopping pitches, and or just having beers. I thought that would be a nice chill summer thing. So mark your calendars, please. Other updates of note, I will be announcing the selections for our diversity and beer rating grant very, very soon. I am waiting on one of our like editorial partners to sign off on what they have committed to. And once I have that email in my inbox, we will be good to go. So that might be another day or two, but it is coming any day now. Also, we've been making really good progress on some refreshes and fun stuff for the awards. Nothing like massively different, but there have been a lot of kind of behind the scenes meetings with folks that volunteered to help with that, Jeff included. Thank you, Jeff. So announcements about that soon. I would like to get those entries open. They usually open in early July, so I'd like to stick to that schedule. So those are coming. All of this is coming. Thank you for your patience. And that is where you RSVP to things. I try to also drop them in the Slack. Finally, the main event. Alexi Front is here to talk with us about preparing for and conducting interviews and podcasts. I am so glad to have Alexi having this conversation because I think his Heavy Hops podcast is fantastic and truly one of the best, not just beer podcasts, because it doesn't just focus on beer, but like the level of interviewing and the depth of conversations are so excellent. And the fact that this podcast just kind of like came out of nowhere like a freight train makes me so happy. It's really inspiring as like a relatively new endeavor, and I'm just so glad that Alexi does it. When he's not doing that, he is putting on music festivals globally. So cool. But also, I met Alexi, I believe, when he was the beverage director and special events lead for Local Option, an absolutely iconic beer bar in Chicago. Fantastic place. And then I also found out from doing some reading, Alexi, that you founded a record label as a wee teen back in the day. I read that somewhere else. Can you confirm or deny that that is true?
I was 18 years old. So that's a teenager, right? Yeah. So
yeah. I mean, when I read the way the media report phrased it, was like, as a teen, it made you sound like you were 13, but 18 is also very young to do something like that.
Yeah, I guess that is misleading, right? Like think of like a 12 and a half year old. I'm going to start a label next year.
I mean, that at 18, I may as well have been 12. So very cool. That's amazing. So yeah, Alexi has been creating cool stuff since at least 2004 and probably before then. So thank you for being here. I am so glad to have this conversation. Is there anything you would want to add to that introduction that I may have missed?
No, I think, thank you for having me and for the kind things that you said about the show. I think that I was surrounded by people who played music and did all of these like amazing things with their hands. They were like they were visual artists, they were musicians. And I had none of that skill whatsoever. No one in my family was musical. I mean, like, these are the people that you stay away from if they're within 5 feet of a musical instrument. Like, that's my family. Like, no sense of rhythm, no one's good at dancing, none of that. And I always loved music and I loved art and I loved these things, but I had no skill to actually create those things myself. But I wanted to be involved in some way. Like I wanted to be a part of the creativity that went into it. And so I think that's why I found myself sort of doing all of these different things, like working, covering music when I was younger, um, starting a record label because I had made all of these connections with these bands in Sweden and in Europe. And so it it's one of those things where you kind of discover that you can't do something, but then you realize there's so many other things that come with that. And I think I was just fortunate to find it at a young age because a lot of people do that for a really long time. Like they try to play music for a really long time, or they pursue something super creative for, I don't mean this in a judgmental way, but probably longer than they should. And they're probably enjoying themselves, and that's amazing. But these industries, kind of like what we were talking about earlier, like these industries need people who want to be involved outside of just creating the thing. And what I found was that I had my own thing to create, and that was the thing about the thing.
Mhm. Does that apply to beer too?
Yeah, so when I worked at Local Option, we did brew some beers and we did some contract brewing, and I was really kind of involved in the marketing side of that, involved in a little bit in the test batching, but the person that who was making these recipes was really darn good at it. And it was another one of those things where, okay, I'm going to be like water in the situation and find all of the other sorts of competencies that play to my strengths that I can do and have really a lot of fun with. And
Mhm.
that meant, the artistic direction, that meant telling the stories about the beers and the characters on the labels. And so um it's always been, that's like my creativity in some way.
Yeah. So you launched Heavy Hops during the pandemic. Heavy Hops being the name of your podcast. It was kind of a new direction for you professionally, personally. Um, Not really something you had done before. What gave you the conviction to do something so different?
Time. I was probably like other people. I was furloughed. At the time, my full-time job was working as a beverage director for a restaurant group in Chicago. There were no room. There was not really room for a beverage director when you can't drink on premise. And so I was furloughed, and I started to really think about how I was spending my time, what I wanted to occupy with that time, and what skills I wanted to practice. And
Mm.
I was missing the social interaction that came with being in a restaurant, or, even much earlier in life, serving people and having these kinds of social interactions. I mean, all that was wiped away, right? So interviewing people was really my way to get back into that in some
Mm.
way. And it touched on something that when I was starting in the music industry, after I sold my bass and my bass amp and was like, all right, I got to do something else with this interest. It was interviewing bands and interviewing people in the music industry that I went to. And so I was able to kind of pick that back up 15 some years later, during the pandemic. And it was so amazing. Like I had forgotten how much I had enjoyed that process of getting to know someone ridiculously well in a really short amount of time.
Mhm.
I really miss that. And so that finding that and getting back into that gave me so much energy to where I thought, all right, I'm gonna, like, as you said, like this thing came out of nowhere. After the first couple of interviews that, like, I built maybe a little bit of a pile of 5 or 6 episodes before launching. And by the 5th one, I was like, all right, this is going to be a weekly thing. This is going to be this, that, and the other. Like, it was a whole thing that I started to really plan out. So what started as sort of a throwback or like, a way to practice socializing and practice my skills ended up being this whole like rediscovery of this thing that I loved, and a way to also, stay in touch with my network within the music industry and within beverage when you couldn't like interface with people face to face.
Yeah. So it sounds like what you've gotten out of this has sort of changed a little bit over time, which I think as writers and like some of us who have been at this a while, you have to constantly like ask yourself what is motivating you still, and what you're still finding joy in, hours in, day to day. How has that changed for you with the Heavy Hops project?
I think that, and that's an interesting point about revisiting and thinking again, all right, what am I getting out of it? Like, what's the purpose of this in some way? And I think that as we kind of came out of the pandemic, that was one part of the purpose shifting, where now I could start doing music events again. And so I could really begin to understand the promotional power that this medium had for promoting the events, because I hate social media. I hate being on Instagram, Facebook. And when people are listening to podcasts, their interaction with that medium goes for so much longer than their interaction with a Facebook post or an Instagram, whatever real thing. And so, and I want to be clear, like it wasn't the intention of doing this show to have it be a promotional thing for something else. But it was one of those happenstances where I found, oh, wow, this actually helps me not have to do this other thing that I don't want to do.
Mhm.
In it, and that's also the way that the podcast format occurred has changed over time. So it allowed me to kind of always have a new answer to that question. So the
Mm.
show started as myself and a very good friend, which is, I mean, co-hosting a podcast. I think Jeff could probably say something about that. That's totally different than going into a conversation by yourself. And there's like a whole different kind of coordination you have to do. And there's interesting like dynamics you can have with your guest if there's two of you versus and one guest. And so it changed when my co-host wasn't able to be on the show anymore, and that changed the show quite a bit too. And so there were always these, whether it was an internal factor to the podcast, or an external factor like a change in the social or environment, there was always some kind of change that was happening that allowed me to reframe that question to myself. And I think it was those kinds of things that allowed it to stay sort of interesting and fresh.
Say more about co-hosting versus hosting solo. Do you like that shift?
It depends. Like, all right, so it was really fun at the beginning when, again, like this was in the pandemic, when if you were a social person, you were craving any kind of social interaction you could have with anyone. And so to geek out with your best friend on a topic with someone who was knee deep in it, that is super exciting in that context, right?
Mm.
And what we found was when we were interviewing a guest that's a little more challenging to break, not to break emotionally, but to break because they have this facade that, they've done a million interviews and they have a shtick that they follow. When you're one-on-one, it's very different it's a little more challenging to kind of push that person in a way that's going to allow you to have your conversation with them,
Mm.
versus if there's two of you. There's a different power dynamic when there's two of you and one of the guest.
Mm.
And so you can come at them from different angles. You can offer different perspectives. You can approach the conversation tactically. Yeah, a good cop, bad
I was
cop.
just
You can
Yes, that's
totally do
exactly
that.
what I was thinking.
Yeah.
Christian,
We
right
we
on.
didn't there were some people I wish we had done good cop, bad cop with, because my co-host of the time, Sam, we're both just like really nice people. And so none of us had it in us to do bad cop, but I think that and I think I interviewed her on a guild thing, was Danielle D'Alessandro, who was the IGB, Illinois Craft Brewers Guild president. I mean, she was tough because she had a shtick, right? She was there to talk about her, political agenda in relation to the breweries. But if we had done good cop, bad cop with her on our podcast, I think we could have actually have had a very different
Mm,
conversation.
yeah.
So yeah,
You
anyone that hasn't tried it should try it at some point. Like, have your best bud, have someone on the show, and try to, coordinate that in some way. But once you kind of get that coordination, and you will, because like you have this sort of, with someone you're close with, you have the telepathic thing going on.
Mhm,
So
mhm,
it's interesting. It definitely can freshen things up.
mhm. I am always struck by how, um, obviously deeply researched your, podcast preparation is. I have appeared as a guest on your podcast, and I was blown away by, like, your preparedness, but it never feels forced, and you allow yourself to kind of naturally go down these lovely little garden paths. And I guess I'm curious if there's like a particular, if that's a result of you having a particular goal for a conversation with someone. Is there a unified thing you're always hoping to get to in these conversations? Yeah. There.
Yeah, I think that the research, there's a couple things. The research is part of making me comfortable to start the conversation,
Mm.
because I don't really feel comfortable sitting with someone unless I know what they're up to. I don't want to have someone. It sounds
Yeah.
very. I mean, it sounds super rudimentary, right? But there are a lot of people that host shows that don't really, as I kind of think of it, like respect the guest. And respecting the guest means knowing something about what they're doing. And so I think that the research makes me comfortable so that I feel like I can sit with this person and have a good conversation, or really more of an interview like you called it.
Mhm.
Um, so it's in one part to get me comfortable so that I feel secure in what I can deliver. And I think that the research isn't necessarily to get me to a grand conclusion about what the guest is up to, but the way that you described it as like these little garden pathways, I think of them as like little curiosities. So anytime, like if I'm preparing for, say, like your interview, or I've interviewed Jeff, who's here as well, there were all these little things that I picked up on when I was reading, your work, Kate, or in Jeff's second edition of the Beer Bible. There were like little things that I, imaginarily circled within what I was taking in. And I do that with music too. Like there will be a little part of a song where I think, oh, there was this weird tempo or dynamic shift, or there was this weird sample that they did, or something where there is some type of you hear tension more in music, but with the writers especially, I can feel them smiling when I read something like, you had a laugh when you were writing this thing, or you thought something was very interesting
Mm,
when you were constructing this sentence. And for me, arriving at that conclusion requires like a lot of research,
mm,
but then getting to that point of that little curiosity, or those 10 little things that I had circled,
mm.
that's what I want to get to be able to laugh and have fun and smile as I get to know someone for an hour and an hour and a half. And so
Mhm. Mm.
I guess if you were to say like arriving at somewhere, that's where I want to get in some way.
Yeah. this all sounds like a very, like you're describing a very natural form of conversation, like things that I find interesting about you are things I'm going to ask about. But can you is it that simple? Like, are you just, how do you generate questions? How prepared are they? Can you speak to like the actual kind of nitty gritty of how you do that?
Yeah. So I read a lot about, so you break it. I'm with writers, so primary and secondary sources, right? So I will listen to the actual music that an artist creates. I will read the actual writings that someone puts out, or I will listen to some interviews that they've done in like a secondary manner. I may read some critique of the music from someone who I think has good ideas, or someone who I know is a horrible music journalist. I'll read their review of this because there's always brilliance in something, right? And maybe they have a perspective that this other, journalist I think is brilliant may not have seen. And so it's all of that is just absorption.
Mm,
But when it comes, and then I synthesize notes and I think about some of this stuff, but I don't want to have those people's conversations. I want to have my own. And so oftentimes it's a matter of, oh, this artist was asked this particular thing and they responded in this particular way. Where could that conversation have gone? Or
mm,
what other responses did I see that didn't really lead to the curiosity that I'm interested in?
mm.
So it can be pretty involved. I would say if I have an hour-long interview, typically I'm spending 4 to 5 hours researching in earnest, you know, what this person or this group does, and what their sorts of perspectives may be, or what really they're trying to accomplish.
Mm.
Um, and that lays the foundation. And I don't always sit with my questions in the interviews. I have them there, but I'm trying to not always read them because that leads to a disjointed execution.
Sure, that makes sense. How
Does that
much
answer your question though?
oh,
Like,
yeah, no, it definitely does. 4 to 5 hours is impressive. Now I see why you have such good interviews. Uh,
is that
it
a lot?
it I don't do this type of podcast, like, I yeah, I don't know. It sounds like a lot to me, but I don't know. Other podcasters on here, correct me if that just feels like okay, Jesse says, "I don't know." That just it maybe
So
that's
one
thinking
says
about
yes,
someone
one says one
yeah,
says yes, one says no. So I
okay.
guess
To me, it's
Alright,
one of
fair
those
enough.
things where having I've had to manage time in my case because I find that you lose a lot of the attention of listeners after like 40 minutes.
Mm.
Also because their commutes are not normally that long, right?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And having someone for 1 hour is fantastic to me when there's chemistry.
Mm,
And it sounds to me, Alexi, that you make chemistry happen by doing the right homework first.
mm,
yeah, the homework is important. I think that's fair because you only have an hour or an hour and a half or 45 minutes, depending on the time and graciousness of your guest, right? So you want to be able to get to that point of having that chemistry as quickly as possible, because you're assuming that the listener has a certain amount of attention span. So they have a certain commute that they're listening to, like you had mentioned, Christian, or that in an even more pessimistic case, they give you 5 minutes and then they ghost your podcast, right? So uh but fortunately, after a certain amount of time, you get some data on your listeners and you figure out maybe, oh, they're actually patient. But I know that I'm not patient as a listener. So I have to get there for myself. And that's also part of uh the comfort or security that I want to have in what I'm doing too.
how much of that direction do you share with your guests ahead of time? I am always curious as to how much people tip their hands before talking to people. I can see pluses or minuses both ways. So curious how you do it.
So if there's sometimes it's requested that I give some direction, and I won't share the questions, but I'll share some of the topics, like maybe 5 or 6 bullet points. And typically that's more than enough for most publicists, or I call them handlers. And so, that's enough for them more often than not. I tend to interview a lot of people. I wouldn't say a lot, but maybe 15 to 20% of my guests are guests who English is not their first language. And so some of them somehow I convinced to come on my show, and they're very insecure about their English. And so they will typically ask for questions, and I have no issue doing that. I want them to be comfortable, and that's worked really well. Sometimes it's also backfired too, where someone really kind of over prepared and it psyched them out. And so that was the times that happened. It was really unfortunate because those people had really amazing things to say. You could read it in what they had prepared, and you could kind of see in them that they were like, oh crap, like I'm psyching myself out. And that sucks. That there's no other thing about it. It just sucks. It's unfortunate. And so sometimes, I've done things where I've re-recorded a whole interview with someone just because they were like, oh, I'm not sure how comfortable I was with that. And I said, I could kind of read it in your body language. I'd be willing to take some extra time if you want to redo this. And then we got a much better result the second time. I didn't really change the content. Like, I was really happy with where it was going. So yeah, long story short, I'm more than happy to, and most people tend to appreciate that because of the research and time that I put in. They like seeing that someone's making an effort.
Yeah, that's a great point. It demonstrates that you're not just some person who heard of them on, like, Googled them and read half a paragraph on Wikipedia. Christian wanted to know if you do a pre-interview to, like, warm up your rapport with that person.
Yeah. So I think what I just talked about was part of it. That's part of the dance before you actually sit down, is letting them know that you have put time into it and that you respect what they do in some way and you respect their time. I also do some things for myself that make me feel comfortable when I sit down interview. And I think both Kate and Jeff have seen this, where I typically send out something ahead of time to all the guests that say, here's how things work on this show. If you can record your side, and there's instructions that way. And it's not, I don't think it's incredibly invasive, but it makes me feel comfortable knowing that they're going to be heard really well, and that we're going to get a good, like, audio quality interview. Because the last thing that you want to do when you're in the middle of a conversation trying to track someone's conversation and ask questions and really get into it, the last thing you want, like, sitting on your shoulder is, ooh, is this going to sound good though? So, like, little things like that can help you kind of get into that like sort of comfortable frame.
Alexi, I have a question.
Yeah. Hey, Jeff.
Hey there. Trying to figure out how to structure an interview versus, like, having an unstructured interview. You want a certain thing out of an interview subject, and you can overstructure those things and really stifle the free flow, or you can get way off track. And I'm curious what your approach to that is.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So I would say that there is some structure to my interviews in terms of with those bullet points, those are kind of must touch topics. And I typically think ahead of time of, okay, in what order is kind of going to make sense. You can't always preempt it because sometimes you want the conversation to flow naturally because you have to put yourself in the listener's shoes. And the last thing you want is like, we're going this way, going that way. So um, I do try to structure it just based on it's mostly intuition, I guess, is like, I think if we talk about this, then I think we're going to end up here. And then after that, maybe we're going to end up here. And in some way, it's your experience in talking with people, and the research helps that too, because then all right, this person tends to respond well to this question, or they respond this way on this particular topic. They've expressed in the past this perspective. So you can kind of build some structure with all of those things, but I would be completely lost without structure. So I definitely favor it. That'd be fun actually to like go in when I did the show with a co-host. Our first interviews were very non-structured, and I mean, it was also like pandemic, so it was great. Like we had 2 hours on our hand and everyone had 2 hours on our hand, and we threw structure out the window. But I think being a little more methodical now is where I found comfort.
Alexi, you told me as we were like doing some back and forth before this conversation that you try to practice active listening skills every day, which is like an incredible, just like human goal. I mean, like, yes, as reporters and storytellers and podcasters, but just like on a human level, I don't know, that really seems like a wonderful thing we could all be doing. But what does that practice actually look like for you? And then what have been the tangible payoffs there?
So I think in order to have the brain space to be able to, and try is an important word because I'm not always successful with that, but in order to be in a position to where you can try means eliminating some other things that are cluttering your brain. And so what I start with every day is I go on a walk without anything in my ears. I kind of just try to take in what's around me and try to limit the amount of exposure to technology as long as possible. In the early part of the day, it's hard to do, but to start in that way, I find that my days start a little more like even keeled, and then I practice basically when I come home from work. I really, try to spend a certain amount of time with my wife or on a phone conversation where I am very sort of intensely listening to everything that they're saying. I'm processing all of that, and I'm trying to then come with a perspective to it in some way. I think if I was doing a ton of interviews every day, if I was one of those people that did like 4 or 5 interviews a day or was reporting, it could be hard. But at the same time, like I also work as a project manager, and part of my job is to decloak the mysteries of this thing that everyone's trying to figure out and then provide direction to it. So you find ways to practice that in a lot of different settings. I think you just have to be conscious that, okay, is this an opportunity for me to practice this? Or is it, is it an
Or am I in the
opportunity? And
checkout
so,
line at Target? Yeah.
yeah, yeah. But I think that the thing that's helped me get to a point where I can try is by limiting that like technology exposure
Mhm.
early in the day, because then you're a little more level and you're a little more like receptive.
Mm. How have you seen this practice pay off? Have you noticed a noticeable change in either in your personal or your professional life, actually?
Yeah, I think that definitely in my personal life, I'm a little more sort of I'm able to express myself a little bit better because I can listen much more effectively, and I'm actually hearing what people are saying instead of what I think they're hearing, or what I think that they're saying, or what I want them to be saying. So I've been able to remove that kind of like imagination or that projection, and that's probably the biggest thing, is having like a little more purpose and focus to listening and putting in that effort.
Um, do you ever feel like you're just not getting out of your guest like what you want as an active listener? You like want this enriching, deep, like soulful conversation full of wonderful anecdotes, and you're just getting like a sponge, or like, I don't know, a sad saltine cracker. And what, how much can you really work with that? What are your strategies there?
It's tough, especially like when you put in so much time to research and you feel like you're getting a dud. I mean, that's not fun at all, right? So I think that, one, you have to, while you're tracking the conversation and while you're figuring out what questions you want to ask, and all the things we've talked about, you also kind of have to check your expectations too. And you have to remember, okay, like, it's not all about me in this situation. The show really is an opportunity for people to hear the guest, and I'm just kind of guiding this thing in some way. Um, so I haven't really dealt with a lot of like combative people, fortunately. That's a whole nother like ball game, I feel. But in terms of people who are like, giving me pretty succinct answers or aren't really showing uh character, I try to use body language, I mean, I'm not like moving I'm not gesticulating in weird ways, but if you try to smile and you try to, make a little more eye contact and show that you're a human, oftentimes that can do a little bit to get someone to open up. And I've spoken with a lot of people from countries where they're stoic and they don't really want to open up to someone. So using body language and little facial things that people can see in this way does actually go a long way. Sometimes you really have to shift the direction of a conversation rather quickly and grab onto something that they're going to respond to in a certain way, and then taking that into another direction, just to kind of help get some momentum, is important. And so knowing like what those kinds of layup questions are, or what is going to get this person to talk, is important. And just having those kind of on the side burner as like all right, I'm in a situation where I need to get out of wherever we are really quickly. This is what I can ask. These are my tools for this situation. So
It's like a breaking case of emergency box, and you're just like, oh shit.
yeah,
We're gonna go to this
yeah,
question. Yeah.
exactly. But I think like showing emotion and showing that you're a real human trying to connect with a real human, most people that are in the creative, that are doing things for a living, or that really care about what they do, if they see that someone is affected in some emotional way by their art or by their conversation, odds are that can kind of break a stone wall in some way.
Hmm. What those are strategies for dealing with more challenging interviews. What about, like, what does a really successful interview look like or feel like for you? How do you know when you're just kind of like firing on all cylinders, and how do you define, I guess, how do you define success for a podcast episode?
When it's over, and so I always do the recap, or I do like the intro notes immediately after the show. That's when I like sit and I'm like, all right, what did we talk about? How am I gonna introduce this episode? I always do that in post, but I do that immediately afterward.
Hmm.
I know like an interview is successful when it's over and I sit down again to do that, and I feel like I blacked out. Like when I don't remember anything that we talked about, or if I can't recall big things, or if I sit and record it and then I listen to the interview back and the conversation was totally different than that, I know it was good.
Hmm.
Because in the former, I mean, you just had a good time, right? And that's part of what it's about for me is I want to smile, I want to connect with someone, I want to have a good time. And then in the latter case, that means that you hit on a number of different cylinders and you really touched a lot of different topics successfully. So those are the two indications for me that that it's gone well.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, you can tell that you were very present and in the moment. If when it's over, you're kind of like, what? I don't know. I just had a good time. What was that about?
Mhm.
Oh, Christian has a good question in the chat that, sometimes just like humans are fallible. People are late. Someone missed your invite. Kate sent the wrong Zoom link twice. How do you like not enter that in a grouchy mood?
Yeah, that's happened to me, and it's happened to anyone that does this. I think it was easier when I didn't have a job to go to and I was like starting grad school and I had more time. But I think as time got smaller and more difficult to manage, I had to remind myself that these are real people with real things going on in life, and sometimes things happen that they don't anticipate. It's not my fault, and it has nothing to do with me why they're late. And so I can't really introduce my ego into that situation uh by being upset about it. You just have to kind of take it on the chin and say, all right, it's going to happen in half an hour, it's going to be another day. All right, I'm going to go flake off and do something else. It took me a while to figure that out, and I think the tougher thing is if you actually get into an interview and you realize it's not going super well and you can't turn it around. That's happened like a couple of times, and you almost know that it's a throwaway, but then you still have to finish it.
Mm.
That's a tougher one. And then you kind of feel like do they know it's like this?
You're on a
I
bad
know,
date.
but like, can they tell that
Like,
I know? I mean, that hasn't happened a lot either, but that anything that has to do with people's time is tough. And you have to recognize that time is precious to everyone.
have you,
And yeah,
I'm sorry, have you recorded episodes that you don't use, that you don't publish?
there were two. One that I described earlier where the guests just kind of psyched themselves out and we did a re-record and it went fantastic. And there was another one where, yeah, the guest just wasn't in the correct headspace to frankly just be recorded. And so we did the interview, and I tried to make them feel good because that they really kind of needed that in the moment more than anything. And I was happy to be that person in that moment to try to lift them up in some way. But then, you know, they knew that the episode was going to be released at a certain date. And I reached out to them ahead of time, just said, hey, you know, I could tell something wasn't really right. And, you know, I'd like to invite you back in the future, but now doesn't really seem like a good time for this. And they were very receptive, and they were really happy that I said it instead of them.
That's about the best outcome you can ask for given those circumstances, I think.
Yeah. You can't, you can do your best to influence the mood, but if someone's coming in with something that's much bigger than what you or I are, it's part of living, right?
I have one last question from an audience member, but then I would invite people to kind of jump in as they'd like. But this was sent ahead of time. Someone was asking for strategies for dealing with the Zoom, or this happens to me on the phone with interviews, the effect of awkwardly talking over each other or trying to find like the actual conversational rhythm when there is a lag or there's a technology in between you.
Yeah, that's hard, especially because I get really excited, and then sometimes like I want to jump straight uh onto something that's being said. I sometimes get like a little impatient, and I try to be better about it, but when you're excited and having a good conversation, it happens. I think that some of it comes down to when I send something ahead of time, like I have some note about the audio. I swear this will answer this question. There's something about the preparation that the guest is often in a good spot to where I know that those interruptions are going to be minimal. And then for them to record the audio, this is something I recommend for anyone who's like podcasting. I know it's a pain in the rear to do single channel editing in post, but I really recommend it from an audio quality standpoint because you can present the conversation as much more cohesive when people are recorded on their own end, because it completely eliminates the lag, and it eliminates all the audio quality issues that the internet presents. I've had conversations where someone's in another part of the world where the internet connection is very poor, and yeah, you just have to be very patient, especially when it's a really good conversation. That's super tough, which that one was, but you just have to wait and just make sure that the person's done with what they're saying. And then you have to patiently kind of go in with what you're saying. And the conversation's going to be a little bit slower, but odds are on their end, they're also hearing that. And so they're going to adjust to that dynamic. Or you can just take a super brief pause and say, hey, this part isn't going to be recorded right now, but I'm hearing XYZ. Can we change how we're doing this or whatever? And as soon as you hear that happening, do that immediately so that you can course correct quickly instead of continuing on trying to awkwardly like negotiate this while also having a conversation.
Excellent. I wonder if other podcasters on folks who do more podcasting than I do, which is zero, have questions about the like post-production aspect or any of the editing, because I didn't even ask questions about that because it is so foreign to me. But if anyone has questions on that technical side, I would welcome you to jump in and ask those. Or anything else that's interesting to you.
I think to me that's actually a good question about how do you normally post process people's audio, given that everybody has like a different quality of microphone, a different environmental sound, etc.
Yeah. So the first thing is having people, and then in my sort of like pre-show prompt that I send to someone after I confirm that they're going to be on the show, I give them, you know, three or four different recommendations on how to record their audio on the device that they're going to be on, or, you know, just on their telephone, because there's so many like pretty easy ways for people to record their audio that they may simply just not be aware of, because um they don't think about it that way. Most people think like, oh, if I just like record, we can just get it on Zoom, and then you have you know, whatever that's going to end up being, but it's not always the best. So giving some recommendations ahead of time makes a big difference. And then I put together like a little folder for people to drop in their audio. So making it super easy for the guest to accomplish that is really important on the buy-in side. And then I have someone that helps me with some of the post. And so he also gives me ideas on what I can tell people or what the tips should be. So I approach it very much like a musical recording in some way, that the voices are a part of this composition in some way. So it's a little bit different than trying to mix a single track. It takes a little bit longer, but the result I think is pretty good, because you don't need super expensive equipment to record very well. You just have to know what you have.
That's interesting. I mean, again, it feels like so much of what you're able to achieve happens before you get on these calls. Like there's just a lot that's setting yourself up for success before you even hit record, from setting expectations to preparation. Just, yeah, set yourself up for success, I guess sounds like the message.
I think so. And like the respect thing is a part of it. Also, so, I mean, I get nervous sometimes before interviews too. And I mean, you're talking to a stranger, of course, like it's you're going to be nervous, right? And so like doing all of those little things, it takes some time to do, but I find at least that I can go into the conversation with the correct level of confidence to be able to be me, instead of like a guarded, scared, insecure version of me, because all these other things that I have that I don't feel like I can control in that moment can be controlled with the preparation.
Mm, well said. I'm gonna stop recording now. Thank you, Alexi. Don't everyone